I'm delighted to welcome Rebecca. Rebecca's main interest is in Old Testament studies. She is the tutor and director of studies at the Eastern Regional Ministry Training Course in Cambridge, where she trains ordinands and other interested adult learners. But she also has had in the past a link with the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. And it's out of those two interests, Old Testament and science, that those two interests have combined to bring about a really interesting publication on the Bible and the sea, particularly coming out of her joint work with an oceanographer. And it's on that topic about theology and the sea that we're going to be focusing tonight. So welcome, Rebecca. It's really good to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here. I'm just disappointed not to be in Reading, actually, because I was brought up in Reading. So I was quite interested to go back and visit the place, but I've missed my opportunity.
So, Rebecca, we'll start there. So tell us a little bit, where did you come from? So for those of you who are watching on YouTube or coming in live who are from Reading, they'll recognise some names. So tell us about your Reading connection.
Yes, well, basically, I was brought up in Reading. We moved there when I was 12, and my parents stayed there for 30-odd years, so they only moved away about 5 years ago, which, if somebody does some quick maths, they can work out how old I am, which is not my intention.
and tell us about the schools that you went to.
I went to the Abbey School in Reading, so yes, I used to drive past, well, my parents used to drive me past the university every day, pretty much, yes. In fact, my mother did a degree there while I was there. So,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, we did a doctorate, actually, I should say.
Yes. And what was her subject at the university?
English literature.
Okay. So I'm speaking from campus now. So she studied her PhD about 50 yards just behind me.
Yes, that's probably right.
And I think when we talked earlier, you mentioned an RE teacher who was actually quite conservative, but that had a bit of sort of formative influence on you?
Yes, that's right. She had an amazing passion and enthusiasm for the subject and a real commitment to how important it was, I think. So yes, she really, I suppose, fired up my love of the Bible. And in fact, when I was at school in those days, you didn't study theology or religious studies, it was scripture. So it's perhaps not surprising that I've ended up staying in the area of biblical studies after that.
I'm really interested in how people become themselves, that sense of formation. What was it about her that kind of opened up the subject for you, that led you down this path? Was there something about her personality or the way she taught it, or?
Yes, actually, she was a hugely committed teacher and a real personality, I suppose. When my year group left, or my class left school, aged 18, collectively, we stayed in contact with this particular teacher for quite a while. She'd been the teacher when everyone entered year 7 and was new. She'd been the form teacher, but despite the fact that was way back at the beginning of the class journey, a lot of people stayed in contact with her just because she had, a very caring human touch, I suppose. And she always came across as very principled. She wasn't the sort of person to misbehave in front of.
And this is something you aspired to.
I couldn't possibly say.
So after school, so you left, I'm very sad, you left Reading, and you went on, I think, first of all to Oxford and then to Durham, and you began there really this kind of journey of discovery about chaos and conflict within the Old Testament. Now, to those who've studied it, they'll kind of think, oh yes, of course we understand that. But if you've not studied the Old Testament, you might not be aware that actually those issues were really massive, have been in scholarship, and particularly German scholarship, strangely enough. So can you just give us a sort of background to chaos, the sea, and the Bible in the Old Testament?
Yes, so basically there are a few passages in the Old Testament, probably rather obscure ones to most people, where God seems to do battle with the sea, or with the dragon in the sea, variously known as Rahab or Leviathan. And in 1895, a German scholar called Hermann Gunkel came up with the idea that these passages actually derived from Babylonian mythology, which he assumed the people of Israel would have picked up during exile in Babylon after the fall of Jerusalem. And basically, there was a Babylonian god, Mardok, who created the world by slaughtering a dragon, or goddess of chaos, called Tiamat. And it describes how he distended her body by blowing the wind into it, and then cut her in two and formed the heavens out of one half and the earth out of the other half. And strange as it may seem, there was a theory for quite a while that actually the story of creation in Genesis 1, to some degree, is dependent on that because of the heavens and the earth. Well, the waters above the heavens and beneath the heavens being split to form the heavenly ocean and the sea beneath. And there was a theory that maybe this derived from the Tiamat myth. And in fact,
so for those who aren't kind of into their Old Testament, just a bit of context. So this is the Babylonian exile, 597 BC, thereabouts. And there's a German idea that people are kind of picking up the mythology from Babylon about conflict. And Babylon's creation story involves conflict.
Yes, that's right. Conflict and then order coming out of conflict. Killing a good god is a very good way of creating the world or human beings or all sorts of things in ancient mythology. But then in the 1930s, there were some texts dug up from a place called Ugarit in Syria, which told stories of the god Baal, whom of course we meet in the Old Testament in terms of Elijah on Mount Carmel, competing with the prophets of Baal to get their gods to light a sacrifice. And it turns out that Baal battled with the sea, or the god of the sea, called Yam, and he also had battles with death, known as Mot. And at that point, scholars began to think, well, actually, maybe this imagery derives more from a Canaanite context, and maybe the way the God of the Old Testament was being portrayed was more akin to Canaanite mythology.
So we move from the 19th century to kind of Babylonian context to a Syrian context, but still working with the same issues about watery struggle.
Yes, that's right. And most of the study of this chaos imagery has tended to focus on looking back at some kind of general ancient Near Eastern background rather than trying to make sense of it theologically within its own context. And a lot of effort, on one hand, went into finding these links and maybe overplaying them. And on the other hand, there were other scholars arguing that really the Old Testament couldn't have anything to do with this kind of mythology. And it was all demythologized and historicized, and there was an effort to make it sound as distant as possible.
Is this the time to share some photographs, some pictures?
It could be, yes.
So Rebecca shared with me earlier a couple of images. Here we go. So what have we got here?
Yes, so on the left we have Mardok with the dragon.
This is the Babylonian creator god, isn't it?
So this is the Babylonian and Syrian creation myth. The one on the right, actually, is the sun god. You can see the sun over what looks like a sort of table figure in the middle, and the god on the right of that will be the sun god. But the interesting thing is you can see waves under the god's throne in both cases. And in fact, you can see from the one on the right that it's the heavenly ocean, because you can see stars dotted along the bottom of the ocean, which gives you an idea of the sort of cosmology of the ancient world, that there was the gods were situated above the heavenly ocean. But I think it also shows the idea of the sea being very much under control, and the gods being an absolute kind of deity. There's no worry about the sea getting out of control and the need to subdue it once creation's actually started.
And then the other image, here we go. So who's this?
And this is Baal. If you see the image on the left, he's holding a thunderbolt. And the other figures, although he's lost his weapons, I think we can see that he would be holding weapons in the original form, which are probably corroded away. So Baal is the god of storm and thunder, but he also brings fertility through bringing the rains. And he's a bit of a warrior god. So in ancient Ugarit, you can imagine, instead of Babylonian imperialism, what we have is a city-state that struggles a lot more to impose order, and where the world feels a lot more unpredictable and unstable. And so the stories of chaos and conflict in a Canaanite context or Syrian context is much more a story of struggle. And in fact, with Baal, you never get the impression that he's fully conquered the sea. Rather, it seems to reflect maybe a change in seasonal cycles, but probably also a much less stable political situation where chaos might impinge at any moment.
I'm just noticing the lovely wavy line underneath Baal's feet on the statue of the left. I guess they're waves, really, are they?
Yes, they may well be, but he's still having to battle, isn't he?
Yeah.
It's a very different kind of...
So there's an image of a god walking on water. Interesting.
You might say that.
So we've got those images. So we've got, you didn't mention the name, but Hermann Gunkel in the 19th century, the German scholar who made the Babylonian collection. And then it gets picked up and sort of reinterpreted through the Ugaritic stuff, through Canaan instead, a bit closer.
Yes, that's right. So Gunkel was writing in 1895, and the link with Canaan was made by John Day in 1985, so 90 years later.
So John Day was the guy who you were going to do your PhD with, and he taught you to some extent. So what was John doing with this stuff?
Well, he wrote his PhD thesis on it in Cambridge. And when I went up to Oxford for a taster day as a sixth former, I went to a lecture that he gave on chaos, and I was completely hooked, having gone from a situation in school where there was quite a conservative religious studies teacher who came from a sort of house church, charismatic, conservative kind of background, then to have this world of Babylonian and Canaanite myth opened up before me. It was just a whole different world. It just gave a completely different perspective on the Bible. I just found it very exciting, actually. But then when I was taught by him, he would set reading from his book nearly every week. At which point I began to wonder if what he'd argued was actually quite as watertight as he thought it was. That's the trouble with getting undergraduates to read your books. They might be persuaded, but they might, take a contrary view.
I think any academic would love it if undergraduates took them to task. Could you give us in a sort of a nutshell, what was John's view? Because I think he really went large on this and tried to apply it throughout the Old Testament.
That's right. I mean, he saw Canaanite mythology in lots of different places in the Old Testament, where, well, I certainly disagreed with him, and I think quite a lot of other scholars would, at least in many cases. And in fact, as well as looking at stories of chaos, there were other instances where he saw links to other Canaanite deities, so battle with death. Things like death being swallowed up actually is quite a good example, death being swallowed up in victory, because Mot, the god of death, and Mot is the word both for death and the god of death, did swallow. There's imagery in the Canaanite myth about swallowing up. So that was that kind of thing. But there are mentions of Rephaim, which are, again, chthonic deities potentially in Canaan. So there are all sorts of things you can find in the Old Testament where there may be a hint of a link with Canaan, and he found every one of them.
So it reminds me of scholarship. Somebody has a bright idea, and then wherever they look, they see that idea.
Absolutely, so, yes.
Yeah. So you come along, upstart undergraduate, questioning this stuff, and you end up writing your doctorate on this, really.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
What were you trying to do, or what did you want to do?
Well, basically, I wanted to counteract the idea that the Old Testament was actually constantly referring to chaos. I mean, I think there's undoubtedly some language which echoes, or some of the vocabulary echoes some of what we see in Canaan. But I think what it was very firmly trying to argue throughout was that there was no battle with chaos. God himself was supreme king. So there may be waves that roar, or nations that are like a threatening sea that might overwhelm them, but God, they could be sure, was always in control, that he was Lord. So there is no battle because he's in a way above a battle. So Psalm 93, for example, talks about the floods lifting up their voice and roaring, but it says the Lord is king, he on high is mighty. There isn't a battle in that kind of context, because in a way, to have a battle, you need equally matched opponents. I mean, if you look at the Canaanite myth, there's the battle with Mot, the god of death. It talks about Mot was strong, Baal was strong. They gored each other like oxen. Mot was strong, Baal was strong. Mot fell down, Baal fell on top of it. It's just, they're very clearly equally matched. And in fact, Mot ends up in the ascendant before Baal comes back and has another go. I'm not quite sure whether that victory is permanent. But it's a real feature of combat. It's not a very interesting combat if somebody wins straight off and there's no battle. And I think that aspect had been overlooked, really. Another area where I disagreed is in the Assyrian Babylonian material. The battle with chaos seems to result in creation. So Tiamat, this watery monster of chaos or goddess, is slaughtered, and the earth and heavens are formed out of her dismembered body. Whereas in Canaan, Baal is not the god of creation. And I think people have made a mistake looking at the Old Testament in assuming that creation results out of victory over chaos. In fact, I wouldn't say there was a victory over chaos. I think
that's interesting, because for
combat there is mistaken.
Quite a while there was an attempt to link the name Tiamat with Tahom, wasn't there? A Hebrew word in the Genesis creation story.
Yes, that's right. So at the very beginning of Genesis, when there was water and darkness, the word for the water or the deep was Tahom, and there was a thought that this was cognate with Tiamat, because both were Semitic languages. So obviously there was some overlap between the two. So there was a suggestion, there was a hint of reference to Tiamat there. But of course, what we forget is that because the languages are related, it's not surprising the words may sound broadly similar. And also there's somebody in Japan called David Sumura, who wrote a book that came out in 2006, who pretty effectively demolished the idea of a linguistic connection. And I think nowadays you struggle to find people studying Genesis 1 who'd actually think of seeing a reference to chaos there.
So if I were just to step back at the moment, so we start with a kind of 19th century idea that sort of Jewish religion looks pretty similar to the religions around it. They're about chaos and struggle. And in your description of the Ugaritic stuff, it's quite cyclical, or maybe even it's like the seasons, isn't it? It just goes round in circles. But what seems to be coming out in your scholarship is actually Israelite religion is rather different. It doesn't have that cyclical quality, maybe?
No, it doesn't. I think that's right. I mean, I think the overwhelming message is about God being in control and being a guarantor of order. What does change, I think, is that in some contexts, that seems to be absolute. And I think I would put Genesis 1 in that category, that when God created the world, he separated day and night. He separated the waters above the earth and below. He created order and structure that we could rely on and depend on. That is how creation is. But on the other hand, if you turn, say, to Revelation, you've got the idea that there's a dragon, which is, Satan, who God's going to have to, deal with in due course before he can usher in the new age. But at the moment, it's a time of oppression where Rome, that kind of demonic power, as it were, has control over people's lives. And it's an oppressive, difficult, destabilizing time. So God, in the end, will defeat powers of evil, but it's not something he's done yet. So although God is the person or the figure to whom people would look to for order and stability, it doesn't mean there's order and stability all the time. And similarly, some of the passages coming from situations, I think probably where, let's say, Jerusalem was under threat. There's talk of the waters lifting up their voice and roaring, and people crying to God for help. And there's trust that God will do that, but there's no guarantee that it'll happen immediately. So I think you see, as it were, this kind of language provides different models for understanding order or chaos in the world. And it's perhaps quite interesting looking at it in the current situation, that we tended perhaps to gravitate towards a Genesis 1 type picture of God created the world and it was good, and that's that. And any difficulty there we might put down to human sin or something like that. But basically God's created a good world. And it's interesting actually that, the efforts to understand chaos in relation to an ancient Near Eastern background, in a way of distancing ourselves from it theologically. And when 9/11 happened, the Church Times published, I think, a very good leading article about understanding it in terms of the Mardok Tiamat myth, which I thought was fascinating. The Church Times, which you would have thought might have referred to the Bible, had to look back to this Syrian, Babylonian model for understanding what had happened.
I think you sent me that text as well, have you?
I did, yes.
Shall I share that?
Yes, thank you.
Let's have a look at that. So here we go. I think,
here
we go.
Slide,
Is it this one? Is it the next one?
Yes, that's right. So, sorry, just the one before. Yes, so it was. George Bush had made a televised appearance after the attack, and his main message was America is open for business. And the writer of this passage is talking about American mythology of, I suppose, commerce and I suppose, global influence in the kind of a capitalist sphere being America's mythology. So, yeah, it was just saying that although Bush had only 4 minutes on television, it was worthy of the great myths of Babylon or any other empire. Tiamat, the sea goddess of chaos, might threaten the order, security, and peace of the empire, but Mardok, the great god of order, will triumph. So for Bush, freedom was the military and economic order in which freedom is realized, and it withstood the attack. So we must now go forward to defend freedom. And of course, it comments that freedom for the Americans, with this imperialism and economic dominance, of course, was the very oppression that maybe might have led to the attack, or at least was perceived in some cases as oppression. But he says the American imperial mythology of invincibility, rooted in its economic and military hegemony, and historically proved by the collapse of communism, had been shaken. In terms of the myth, this simply could not have happened, but it did happen. And I think that goes to the heart of why it was such a traumatic, well, I suppose naturally it was a traumatic experience, but that whole idea of, I suppose, American invincibility in many ways, because they hadn't ever been invaded, was just destroyed by that one effect, that one event. But yeah, I just thought that was a fascinating take on it. But particularly that dependence on Babylonian mythology, rather than looking to stories of chaos and order that we can actually find in the Bible.
So the recurrent desire to reach for a myth in which something powerful defeats something chaotic is pretty deep-seated.
Yes.
Yeah, and we don't have to look to a sort of Superman story. Actually, it could be a president apparently standing there and treading down chaos.
Yes, absolutely.
Just very quickly, have we any idea why it was that the Israelite view of God was much more nuanced? So it doesn't go down the Ugaritic line. It has much more sort of a mixed message. Do we have any idea why it was that Israel began to develop a more subtle understanding of God?
I think there are several things. One, of course, in the Bible, we have theological texts spanning many centuries. And in fact, there are probably echoes of earlier ideas, which might go back 1,000 years before, even within an Israelite context, before some of the later texts. Whereas obviously, whatever you dig up archaeologically from an ancient Near Eastern context is bound to be a very sparse reflection of the range of ideas. So I think we've got to be aware of the limitations of extra biblical evidence. But I think the key thing was monotheism, that in Canaanite religion, there was a battle between gods, and Baal was actually fundamentally not of any higher rank than was Mot, the god of death, or Yam, the god of the sea. And in fact, if they were seen as relating to climate and seasons, all of them had a place. And much as people would have prayed for Baal to prevail over Mot, for example, to bring the rainy season after the hot, dry season, it was all part of the world they knew and part of the order they expected. Whereas once you have monotheism, then that pattern simply doesn't work. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is that one thing that came out of the exile and the destruction of Jerusalem, it was such a cataclysmic defeat. There were probably only two solutions, and one was to assume that God was actually a rather inferior local god who'd been defeated. And no doubt there would have been people who decided actually they would have been better worshipping Mardok themselves. But for those who stayed faithful to him, then I think there was only one other solution, which was, I suppose, encapsulated, for example, by Tutor Isaiah, that if he wasn't no God worth the name, then paradoxically he must be the greatest God, because actually he's manipulating the most powerful nations on earth in accordance with his purpose, even if it was to punish his people so that they might come back to him. So then he becomes a God of the whole world, and with absolute control. So that's when you get the idea of, the nations are just as a drop in a bucket. All flesh is grass. There's nothing that is of any significance to God because he's so powerful. So I think there's a real paradox there, that actually you end up with the greatest God in the situation of the greatest weakness.
That's fascinating. So out of an experience of trauma and having to rethink God comes a much sort of bigger concept, or a more transcendent concept of God. Naughty question. So you are challenging some orthodoxy. What's it like to go against the established view, or to challenge that? Do you remember at the time how that felt?
Well, I suppose in a way it's what everyone aims to do when they're writing a PhD thesis anyway, isn't it? You're meant to come up with something original, and if it isn't, you've got to pretend you're saying something. Or that you've rediscovered something that everyone else has rejected or forgotten about. So in a sense, I don't think there's anything new in that experience. The only thing that was maybe slightly different for me is I started off being supervised by John Day, who'd written the book I was disagreeing with, which sort of made sense to those who made that arrangement because we were interested in the same area. But he was less enthusiastic. So I ended up changing supervisors. But the other thing is, I mean, there have been other books written on chaos since my book came out. So it moves on. So I suppose I'm one step behind some of the more recent publications, and things are moving on.
There'll be a young whippersnapper who's biting at your heels as well. Somewhere.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Lots of people have said I'm wrong as well. So that's all part of the course.
So your thesis was published in 2006, and then you moved on to looking at stuff about the ocean and the theology. Tell us a bit about how that came about. I think that was through the Faraday Institute, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. So they appointed a new associate director, Meric Srokosz, who's a professor at the National Oceanography Institute in Southampton. And with the post came a pot of money to do a research project. So being an oceanographer, he obviously had a very positive view of the sea, and he really rather wanted to rehabilitate the sea in the eyes of biblical scholars, because so many people have written on the Bible have taken a very negative view of the sea, or at least they've assumed that the Bible itself is negative about the sea, that it's all about God subduing chaos or Jesus stilling the storm. So the general perception is Israelites didn't like the sea, they were afraid of the sea, and it's metaphorically associated with evil and chaos and so on. So he wanted to work with a biblical scholar to re-examine these texts and to see if connections could be made with oceanography. And of course, because I'd already written probably the most positive book about the sea in biblical studies, I was an obvious partner to work with them. And of course, for me to take on that role was fantastic because it tied in with one of my interests as well.
What was it like with working somebody from a different specialism, not the humanities, but the sciences? Was that a creative thing or a frustrating process or a bit of both?
I loved it. It was wonderful, actually. I think we learned a lot from each other. And I suppose one of the good things working with someone of a different discipline is we were from such different disciplines, there wasn't much scope to disagree hugely because we were just coming with, with very different perspectives, but actually being in fundamental agreement about the value of the sea in the Bible and the importance of translating that into a modern context. I mean, for a start, a more positive view of the sea is very important from an ecological point of view. If you take a negative view of the sea and its creatures, it's not going to encourage you to conserve it. And there haven't been anything written from a theological perspective, I don't think, to help with, as it were, blue theology. So I think that was a really important contribution to make.
Okay, so let's pick out three areas of I like the expression blue theology then. If we have a look at the Bible and the sea, what does the Bible actually say about the sea, do you think? If it's not this negative thing that needs to be controlled and chaos is like the sea, what do we really get?
Well, for a start, of course, God created the sea. That's the most obvious thing. But also, when it comes to creating sea creatures, he actually tells the waters to bring forth the sea creatures. So it's actually quite generative. It's a partner with God in creation. The second thing is it praises God. So, for example, Psalms 96 and 98, it says, let the sea roar, and in praise of God, along with the hills clapping their hands and all this kind of thing. So I think it's portrayed as in genuine relationship with God. The other thing is, a lot's been said, as we've been discussing, about chaos, the idea of the sea being in opposition to God. But actually, in reality, the sea does as God or his agents say. So when Jesus stills the storm, there's no suggestion that the storm is going to carry on raging anyway. Or, the crossing of the Red Sea. Can you imagine Moses lifting his staff and nothing happening? The compliance of the sea is so written into the fabric of the Old Testament, we don't even see it. So I think there's a lot that's very positive about the sea, and of course about the creatures of the sea as well.
And if we were to take the the sea and put it back into the context, does it change the way we see humans? Is there a sort of a feedback, as it were?
Yes, I think there is. So I think one thing that's really important with the portrayal of the sea in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament is human vulnerability on the sea. And whether you're talking about Paul being shipwrecked at Malta or some of the Old Testament material we've been discussing, there's something about being on the sea where people really know their dependence on God. And of course, we see that even with modern writers, things like Amazing Grace, for example, perhaps arising out of an experience of nearly drowning on the sea. It's nothing quite like being in the middle of an ocean to know your own vulnerability and your dependence on God, that in the end we are small specks within a very large creation. And there are many forces in the world that we're still powerless to influence. And I think in the modern world, perhaps we experience that uniquely in the sea, but that very much comes out in the Bible. Another thing that comes out actually is the sea is somehow a divine realm. We get that particularly in Ezekiel. There are oracles against Tyre. So Tyre was a Phoenician city, and the Phoenicians were the great traders of the ancient world. They travelled the length of the Mediterranean, and we think up to Spain, to Cadiz, which was just amazing within that context, really. And Ezekiel portrays Tyre as a ship laden with the most luxurious goods that even seem amazing today from right across the known world. But there's also a sense of amazing sort of hubris, and this is somehow something that there's an arrogance about what they're doing that doesn't seem quite right. So Ezekiel portrays the king of Tyre as proclaiming himself as a god. And it's just very interesting because the prophet talks about the beauty of the great ship, the wisdom of Tyre. There's a lot that's very positive about it, but yet on the other hand, it's just not quite right. It's the divine realm that they're infringing. And there's a very interesting oracle which picks up the language of the Garden of Eden. And it talks about this great ship being in the garden of God in the midst of the sea. And it seems to pick up the story of Eden. And just as Eden ends with, and as we know from Genesis 3, Adam and Eve being cast out of the garden, Tyre is shipwrecked. So there's something about the sea that's a divine realm. It's this great, powerful, unknown region that we'll never understand, and it's not quite ours to feel we can dominate. So I think that's another thing that I think is quite a salient message for the modern world, really. And then there's obviously teaching to do with human relations to, say, the fish, which are also very important. There are a number of really quite small references. There's one in Habakkuk, another one in Ecclesiastes, to the fish of the sea being vulnerable. And they're used as a metaphor for trouble or for invasion by other nations. But somehow, just as a fish is vulnerable to being caught in a net, so the people of Israel are like a fish with some merciless hunter coming to get them. So there's a real sort of ability to relate to the plight of a fish being caught. Because I think, well, in modern sort of, high capacity fishing, we have perhaps completely lost. And I suppose another way that comes out is in the miraculous catch of fish, which at the end of John's Gospel is 153 fish, big fish, but 153 being a measure of the surprise generosity and power of God. When people are fishing now in huge vessels, which come back with tons, a lot of it bycatch, it puts a completely different perspective, I think, on what we're doing.
When you and I were chatting about this a couple of weeks ago, I think you'd had the sneaky suggestion of what would happen if this went through to our Eucharistic language, because obviously the two feedings that Jesus have involve fish.
Yes, that's right. So Jesus blesses and distributes fish more than he does wine. Which possibly wouldn't make our churches smell too good. But yes.
Pilchards at communion, I can just see it happening now.
Well, of course, it's still used as a Christian symbol, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
So it's got the double value.
Yeah. Lovely. Really interesting talking with you. Now, you've set us a bit of homework to do now. We're going to break up into groups. If I share the screen, do you want to talk us through what you think would be a good thing for us to do in breakout rooms? So if I take us back here. Now, you'd picked out a particular passage, hadn't you? You thought that would be worth us having a look at.
Yes, so it comes near the end of the book of Job, well, second last chapter. So for people who are not particularly familiar with Job, the story of Job is an archetypally righteous man who enjoys God's favour, and then suddenly he loses everything. His health, his children die, he loses his property, everything. And he sits on a ash heap or dung heap and scrapes his sores with a bit of broken pottery and feels generally miserable. And he is tempted. Well, his wife says, "Just curse God and die." And I think that's how he's feeling. And his friends, who are supposedly sitting with him to comfort him, then proceed to tell him that it's all his fault. That if somebody's suffering, it must be to do with their own unrighteousness. And Job disputes that. He says, I wouldn't pretend to be perfect, but there's nothing I've done to merit this. And he challenges God, challenging God because he doesn't see what God has done is right. He challenges him to meet him in a law court and to justify what he's done. And God's answer is not to speak directly to Job's issue, but to parade before Job the wonders of the created world. And God's power over creation. And he starts off with talking about how he I suppose, is in control of the really huge scale of creation. The storehouses of the rain and snow, and he brings the stars out and knows their paths, and the deeps of the earth, and everything is within his control and on a scale that Job can't imagine. And then he talks about the animals that he looks after, wild animals that have nothing to do with human life. But he, again, provides for them, whether it's the lions roaring for their prey or the wild ox, where he makes it rain where there are no human beings so that there's grass for the ox and so on. And then he ends with a second divine speech out of the whirlwind, where he parades two huge creatures in front of Job. So one's Behemoth, sort of hippopotamus-like creature, and the other one's Leviathan. So Leviathan is this dragon figure we've been talking about. But the interesting thing here is Leviathan is a prized part of God's creation. He's terrifying. Even the sons of God, as the phrase puts it, sort of angelic beings, are terrified at his crashings and roarings and so on. But for God, he takes delight in this creature. And the interesting thing is, this somehow is God's answer to Job about the problem of suffering. And I won't give any spoilers here.
Okay, lovely.
I'll leave it to everyone to discuss.
So what we're going to do is we're going to get people invited into breakout rooms. I think I'm going to invite questions, as it were, from the floor. So if you'd like to unmute yourself, please feel free to do that. Note that if you do that, you will appear on our video. So if you're not comfortable about doing that, turn off your video when you ask your question. It would be really helpful if you just introduce your name at the beginning as well. So who would like to kick off with a question or a comment? Dino, I think you and I were having a quick conversation before. Do you want to chip in?
Yeah, thanks very much, Rebecca, for the historical context, which was very interesting, although because I'm a scientist rather than a historian, it didn't really chime with how we should be looking at the sea today and going forward. So I'd really like to understand your perspectives on that. How do we view the sea in the context of world ecology now, in the light of our view of God's attitude towards the sea?
Sorry, do I answer that now, or we?
Yeah, go for it, Rebecca.
Yeah. Yes. So, well, I think God, because God created the sea and values the sea, then I think there's every reason that we should do that. And particularly, you can see God's attitude to the fish and other creatures of the sea, like in this passage, actually, with his delight in Leviathan, I think really invites us to share God's concern for this part of his creation, I would say.
Thank you.
Dina, do you want to come back and say some more? Or what do you think?
Well, I think the sea is a very important part of creation, and right from the Genesis account, the sea, and the land were divided one from another. and it's very clear that it's integral to creation, and the fact that it goes through into the New Testament as well. Jesus, walking on water, and a whole lot of water seems very important within the whole of creation. So I think we need to treasure it and cherish it as something that God has given us.
Is it, I speak as a vegetarian, Rebecca, but I'm a vegetarian who eats quite a lot of fish. And I wonder whether there's a bit of a category error that some people have, and somehow the sea is an other. And there's a kind of quality that maybe we don't value it in the same way that we would land animals. Is there anything in there?
Yes, and maybe also there's been a tendency for people to feel that if they want to throw their rubbish into the sea, whether it's sewage or whatever, that somehow it'll disperse and go away, and it's somehow a different kind of space that somehow can swallow endlessly whatever it's being asked to absorb. And of course nowadays it's often carbon dioxide, isn't it, from which we get ocean acidification and all sorts of things. But I think we have tended to assume that the sea is so vast and wide, as it were, that nothing we can do can impact it, which is another error that's coming back to hit us, I think.
So part of its size has tripped us up in terms of not realising that it too is fragile.
Yes, yeah, I think that's right.
So who'd like to ask a question?
Mark, if I may, just to follow up on that.
David, yep.
Yes, I've always been puzzled by to follow up on your point, which I think is an interesting one. The way fishermen, for example, are expected and exhorted to reap where they don't sow. The idea that the ocean is a place to be despoiled for profit without any work involved. Well, obviously there's work involved, but without any sort of effort involved.
Yeah. Rebecca, do you want to comment? So there's a difference between being a fisherman and being a farmer, I guess, is the...
Yes, although of course now we do have fish farms, for better or worse. Yeah, I mean, there have been suggestions actually that we should transfer the idea of the Sabbath or Jubilee years and so on to the seas, and that maybe we should transfer that in a geographical way to marine protected areas, or simply to give the sea rest, as it were. So at certain times not to fish, and that might be important breeding periods, for example, or it might be simply giving certain species at least times of rest when we're not fishing them, to allow numbers to recuperate. And apparently fish numbers went up enormously, say during the First and Second World Wars, because obviously people were not going out to sea, in a war zone, and it had an immense effect on fish numbers within the sea. So certainly giving rest can have, quite a significant impact very, very quickly. I'm not sure what else we can do apart from being sensitive to the needs of the sea. I don't know in terms of sowing and reaping what we might do. I
can see a hand being waved on Rosemary's iPad. Rosemary.
Yeah, I don't know where the virtual hand is. So it's just from our discussions of Job 41, it seemed to be saying that you should value the sea creatures for what they are and not just regard them as a resource to be exploited, that God created them to delight in them. And we found this cross-reference to a psalm where it says that God created Leviathan to frolic. And so that seems to be the attitude that Job 41 is encouraging us to. It's not that you're not supposed to be able to just pin these things down and stick your knife in them.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there are two sides to that, aren't there? One is God's delight in Leviathan, and Leviathan being there to enjoy the sea, or God to enjoy him. And on the other hand, there's that picture in Job, isn't there, of Leviathan defying any human attempt to control or to view him in a utilitarian way, that, you can't hunt him, you can't eat him, you can't sell him, you can't use him as a pet or a toy or put him on a lead or anything. He's not there at all with reference to humanity. In fact, he's threatening to humanity, but he has a celebrated part in God's creation.
Can I ask whether people's conversations went any way to looking at the Job passage and the current chaos, and whether some of the biblical images of God working with chaos might help us as we deal with our chaos. Did anybody have any thoughts about that?
We looked at how the
Lorraine.
creature, Lorraine, yeah, how the creature is in here is, you're not supposed to control it. It is, like Rebecca was saying, you're not to tame it. It's there as part of creation. And also, if you read some of it, you could imagine it being quite scary and frightening. And the pandemic is quite scary and frightening at the moment. And we can't control it or tame it. We just have to try and live the best way we can alongside it at the moment until we understand it more. So that's a sort of aspect I got from it, from the passage and the pandemic today.
Thank you. Anybody else have thoughts on in that vein? Chris?
Yeah, following on that thought, yeah, somebody was saying that, you know, we could see these monsters as, in a way, being God's answer to Job, because everything that's happening to Job at the time, his illnesses and so on, are like an attack from a monster. And you get that long list of things that say that we can't tame this monster. And God wants us to realize that we can't tame it, and we really need to wait and trust him, because he is the only one that can actually tame this monster, or do anything with it, maybe not tame. I was just thinking about the way in which some of our politicians have liked to personalize the virus and talk about it as a bandit, that we're going to, you know, a robber bandit that we're going to get the better of, you know. And sometimes people talk about cancer like that. Some of the cancer charities talk about it like that, and try and get us to get angry, and we're going to control it, we're going to beat it, because we humans are bigger than this stuff. Yeah, and that's not quite what God is encouraging us to do.
I've just had a hand up from Sandra. Before we pass over to Rebecca, can we derive a spirituality of chaos from the Leviathan, do you think?
Essentially we have, because I think we can, because I think the message of this divine speech is the world is beyond human comprehension, and yet it's in the hands of God, and it's not centered around us. We tend to assume it is, but I think a very clear message from God's delight in Leviathan, that it's not just here for human beings. Creation as a whole is a delight to God, including the bits that are really quite inimical to humanity, and completely beyond our comprehension. And I suppose one of the messages we hear about the virus is that viruses are vital to life. Apparently all placental mammals derive, you know, their reproductive abilities to the existence of a virus genome in their DNA and so on. So I don't know, with everything that gives life, there's also a downside, isn't there? So mutations enable evolution, they enable survival, but obviously mutations can go wrong, say with genetic diseases, or, you know, volcanoes enable you know, new Earth to be created in many ways. It's one of the vibrant parts of being on a live planet, as it were. But obviously, if you're in the path of a volcano, it's not such good news. So maybe if you take that cosmic God's eye perspective, there is a place for this, even though it's not so good for us right now.
But if we took a Babylonian view, we would be smashing that chaos rather than realizing actually it's part of us. It's made us.
Yeah, and you can see some of the politicians' rhetoric fitting more of that kind of model. Yeah, I think, you know, Trump, for example, would definitely be a kind of Mardok, style himself as a Mardok of the Western world, perhaps, if he could.
Boris as Baal. Sandra, you had your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment?
Well, it's a reflection as well, but it's is that that in fact it is thought that the pandemic may have been caused in the first place by the exploitation of the animals that are our neighbours, and there's a certain irony in that it's by not respecting, by trying to damage that part of creation, that we have in fact damaged ourselves.
Thank you. Miriam, I can see you waving at your screen.
Yeah, hi. I've got a question about that. So I thought this whole passage was challenging the idea that humanity is in charge of things, which we like to be. And I wondered if, with conservation and things like that, whatever we try and do to protect resources, to make sure things, don't get depleted, doesn't that mean that we're still in charge, that we're still putting ourselves in that sort of pinnacle of creation position just by conservation efforts?
I think the difficulty is, I suppose, it's a bit like, the argument about in the face of evil, all it takes is for good people to do nothing. There's no such thing as doing nothing in a way. Is that anything you do has an impact? And maybe that's where the idea of dominion comes in. Because whether we like it or not, we talk about being in the Anthropocene era, don't we? That we are having a kind of geological scale impact on the earth. And I think by denying our impact, well, it doesn't necessarily help, does it? So I suppose the key is to try and divest ourselves of any sense of arrogance, but in humility to recognize that we do have a huge impact on other species by our actions. And therefore we have a responsibility to act towards the rest of creation in a way that's in accord with God's delight in it and valuing of it, and of creation as a whole, not just specific bits of it that we happen to like and find useful.
Sam, I can see your hand. If there are any other people who would like to wave at the screen just to queue up while Sam asks his question.
Just, I want to say it's very helpful to kind of emphasize the presentation as something other than chaos within the Bible, but there is quite a strong element of like Psalm 107 or Jesus calming the waves, or particularly at the end of Revelation where it says there is no longer any sea. Sea is presumably there sort of standing for political chaos. There is the element there. What would we make of passages like that? Or do we just sort of accept them as talking about the sea as chaos, but then don't let that become the only voice? Or...
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there are a whole variety of perspectives within the Bible, maybe reflecting a variety of situations. There are times, I think, when it feels quite comfortable to say, there is no chaos and God's in charge and everything's fine. And there are other situations where it feels as if the only way to deal with, I suppose, if you like, evil in our midst or chaos in our midst is to eradicate it completely, which I suppose fits with the kind of political rhetoric that we hear in terms of personalising the virus. And then there are lots of positions in between. I'm not sure whether you can pick any of them as, the right answer. They're just different approaches, aren't they? I think chaos provides a vocabulary in a way and a series of metaphors that you can use to, in many ways, to voice different perspectives on the world and the place of chaos within it. I think they all affirm God is in charge, but there are different experiences, suggest different pictures of the extent to which that's a present reality or something that will maybe, one day be realised, but isn't among us now.
Roger, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, make your comment?
I live in Nairobi. I live and work in Africa. And here we have a holistic worldview. And I'm wondering if it's one of the aspects is the conflict between the dualistic and the holistic worldview. The Old Testament certainly is written in the holistic worldview background. And here, when we are interacting with fishermen, particularly, whether it's in the ocean or in Lake Victoria or what have you, there's very much a sense that fishermen are not in control of their environment, and they're very much at the influence of the waves and the weather and such like. And so there are many, many rituals and things and doing things the right way before you go out that have been brought in. And I think one of the aspects is that fishermen perhaps are far less in control than farmers of their own production method, particularly when they're going out in small boats and without all the modern technology. Now, I was wondering if this is actually part of the message there that we're getting in terms of the ocean in the Bible.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, actually. I think there's a very strong sense of human vulnerability. And of course, fishermen not just having a less predictable livelihood in terms of finding fish, but also their lives being at risk sometimes by going out on the sea. I mean, for example, the story of the stilling of the storm very much gives the impression of storms arising suddenly without warning, and all they can do is cry to Jesus for help. Or if you look at the book of Jonah, or say, you cry to God for help, don't you? Which pretty much equates to the same thing. But in the end, if you're on the sea, you're in the hands of God, aren't you? And in fact, there's a lot of evidence from ancient fishermen that prayer and ritual was a vital part of going to sea. And there were all sorts of shrines and things along the coast, because prayer was, for them, I suppose, a lifesaver. They very much knew themselves to be part of creation, vulnerable, and in the hands of God.
And it's very much the present day for many fishermen here in this continent, in Africa.
Yeah.
I wonder, just to bring things back in, because we have to come to an end, but obviously one of the images of the church is in fact an ark, a large boat.
Yeah.
The church is the place in which you travel through chaos, maybe?
In a way, the ark is this place of safety, isn't it, and salvation. But yes, certainly on the waters that, well, yes, maybe stormy waters at times, who knows. Yeah.
Indeed. Can I invite people to unmute themselves? We'll do this, and we'll have a. But we can't do it spontaneously because people need to unmute. But Rebecca, can we just say thank you so much for speaking tonight at Café Théologique? So can I invite people to give a round of applause now?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.